is starting. Uh, for those of us who watch us later on YouTube, welcome to this event, the paper review process. Basically, the outline of this event is going to be short talks. We will go in the following order. G, then Lars, then Xuejiao, then Ben. And then following that, we'll have an open discussion, which will not be part of the recording. Please keep your mic muted. That will help everyone in, better audio quality and everything, and keep things organized. And we are a smaller group, so if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand to ask a question, and then the presenter will take your questions from there. So with that said, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to G to start his presentation.
All right, thank you, Slayman. Thank you for organizing all this. And then let me share my screen so I can start with my presentation. All right, so can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yep.
All right, so I'm gonna start presenting. Hello, everyone. My name is actually Guo. I am an assistant professor at Clemson University. So I joined Clemson in 2020 in the spring semester after I finished my postdoc at Carnegie Mellon. My research is mainly in the design and control for lower limb wearable devices. So that includes artificial lower limbs and exoskeletons. Okay. As a new faculty, I have been publishing in both the control side of, journals and conferences from the control side, as well as the robotic side. So today I'm gonna give you some a very brief presentation, and I'm gonna talk about the things that I feel like are important that everybody should know. So to start, let me just do a very brief introduction about the overall paper review process. Some of you have already known this, right? But some of you are just fairly new to this process. So basically, everything starts with you submit your paper, right? Either a conference or a journal. And then what's going to happen is that your paper will be assigned to a senior editor. Now, I'm talking about the general cases here, right? So for different journals and conferences, you might have different names for this position. For example, just editors or editors-in-chief, something like that. Okay, so after your paper has been assigned to a senior editor, what's going to happen is that this senior editor will choose his or her associate editors. Okay, and then these associate editors will choose their own reviewers. Now, again, based on different journals and conferences, there are different requirements. So some conferences require that each paper needs to have at least 2 decent reviews. So you can definitely invite 5 or 6, but definitely no less than 2. Okay. So once the associate editor finish choosing their reviewers, they're gonna gather reviews from all these reviewers, and then send out a recommendation back to the senior editors. And finally, these senior editors are going to make decisions on your paper and then send out notifications to the authors. So basically, typically for a paper, you're gonna get one of these 4 results. Number 1 is acceptance, and then you don't have to do any revisions. Number 2 is something called conditionally accepted, which means your paper has been accepted, but you have to do some minor revisions to satisfy the requirements from the reviewer, such that the paper can be eventually officially accepted. Okay. And then the third condition is something called revise and resubmit. What this means is that the reviewers point out some major issues of your paper, but it's not the end of the world, right? They hope to see that how you can address their comments. And then if you did a good job, they will eventually accept your paper, okay? And the last case is the worst case scenario, which is reject. And then they don't even allow you or say to encourage you to resubmit. So basically, these are the 4 conditions that you will encounter, right? Now, of course, if you are submitting to a journal paper, if 2 or 3 happens, then what you need to do is to revise your paper based on the comments from the from all the reviewers, and then basically resubmit. Okay. For a conference, after you get the results, that's it. Okay. Now here again is a very typical process on how your paper gets reviewed, and then how you get the results from your paper. Okay. Now I want to point out some interesting facts right here. I was the associate editor for IRAS 2021. So just to give you guys some perspectives, we have overall 26 senior editors, about 400 associate editors, and about 4,000 reviewers. Okay. And then in terms of the turnaround time, it really depends. Usually for a conference paper, it's no more than 6 months, which means after you submit your paper, you should be able to hear back from your whether you're from you should be able to hear back regarding your paper has been accepted or rejected within 6 months. And for journals, it really depends. Some journals take a long time to get back to you. Some journals have a dedicated deadline for reviews. They ask the reviewers to turn in their comments within 2 weeks, and then they can probably get back to you within a month. Okay, it really depends on what journals you're submitting to. And lastly, some journals only allow limited numbers of resubmissions. So, for example, if you have ever submitted to IEEE Access, they only allow you to resubmit once. Okay, if your paper still cannot be accepted after the second resubmission, then it's done. Okay. All right. I'm gonna talk about some key points that I feel like are important. First of all, what are the important things that I feel like you should know when you're reviewing a paper? Number one, I don't think it is your duty or obligation to check the equations or derivations line by line. If you see something that is obviously wrong, you should definitely point out that in your comments. But other than that, it's not your duty to check the technical correctness line by line for the authors. It is their job to do this. Okay. And then the second thing is that when we are reviewing papers, try to be critical. But being critical doesn't mean you have to be a jerk. Okay. You should basically judge how good this paper is based on the contents provided. Okay. It's not like, for example, if this paper is talking about the benefits of eating an apple, right? So you should basically judge whether their arguments or proofs or anything related are reasonable or not, right? A jerk comment, in my opinion, will be, oh, why don't you talk about eating, pineapples? Why don't you talk about eating pears? Why don't you talk about eating peaches? Well, these comments, in my opinion, are jerk comments because they are not really focusing on the content of your paper. Okay, so whenever you are reviewing a paper, as long as they did a decent job in literature reviews, in other words, as long as they talk about why we care about eating an apple, then you should basically, check their contents. Okay, and then provide decent feedback. All right, so lastly, I would say that writing is actually very important. We should definitely not reject a paper just because some sentences have grammar mistakes. As a non-English speaker, I make mistakes all the time. But if you see too many typos, that's a problem there because it reflects the author's attitude towards writing. Okay. And finally, I would say when you're reviewing this paper, if you think the word presented is not novel enough, prove your argument with references. Oftentimes I got comments like this, oh, this work is not novel enough. Somebody else has done similar things in the past. That's okay, but who is this somebody, right? what are the work that they did in the past. You have to list references. For example, paper 1 talks about this, which is very similar to what the authors are trying to do. Okay. So that's basically the key points for reviewing a paper. Now, how do you respond to reviewer comments? Well, I would say the very first principle is that you never take these comments personal. Remember, most reviewers are decent reviewers. They're not gonna just attack you based on who you are. What I do is that if I get really angry after seeing all the comments, I basically leave the comments there for a week, and then after a week, I reread all these comments and then think about the revisions that we need to make for this paper. So don't make any decisions or send out an email to the associate editor when you are very angry. Okay. And then oftentimes some reviewers don't tell you exactly what they're looking for. So you have to understand the deep implications. Okay. So for example, if some reviewers tell you that, your state of art, if somebody just tell you, for example, somebody else has done similar work, right? And then they point out the references. What that means really is that your literature review, or say your introduction, is not very intact, right? You should definitely spend more time citing more papers to make this whole introduction part more intact, okay? And then finally, if you really see some unreasonable comments, always report or say negotiate that with the associate editors. I'm going to share one experience that I had when I was submitting a paper. So as I mentioned, my research is in the control and design for lower limb variable robotics, right? So we submitted a paper to a journal. I'm not going to mention the name of this journal, but one of the reviewers said that our work is a duplication of other people's work. And then we checked the comments. And we checked the papers in the comment. And it turned out the paper that the reviewer mentioned is actually about rodents. Basically, that paper talks about what's going to happen if we take out the spine of a rodent and how would the rodent ambulate, right? As you can tell, this has nothing to do with our research, right? We are not even studying the same topic. So we report that to the associate editor, complaining that this reviewer is not providing a decent feedback. And then it turns out that the associate editor of the journal, just ignored that reviewer's comments and then give us another chance to resubmit our paper. Okay. So the bottom line is that if you're seeing something that is really unreasonable, you can always negotiate with the associate editor. Okay. All right. So that's my 2 cents here in reviewing papers. I guess I'm going to hand it over to the next panelist.
Thanks, G, for the presentation. Before we move to Lars, I just make a quick comment. I think I misread the results. The question was about the straw poll. The question was, should we stop recording? And the majority said no. So we will be continuing the recording of the open discussion. Apologize for that mistake. I guess next up is Lars. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Just give me a second. I'll see. Oh yeah, this works, right? Can you still see the whole slide?
Yeah, we can see the whole window.
And also the cursor, just for my...
Your cursor, yes, we can see it's on play.
Oh, perfect, because I like to use it. Okay, I prepared a lot of slides. Might just the talk might be a bit too long, so just stop me, Slayman, when I'm running over. Okay, first a bit about me. Well, I'm from Germany originally. I did my bachelor
Lars,
there.
I think you're sharing, I think, the wrong window. So you're sharing the keynote thing, so we can see the, yeah. Oh, you're gonna explain like that. You're not gonna like expand or play.
Just give me a second. What can you see right now? Can you see
Oh,
one
no.
slide or several
Yeah,
slides?
we can see the keynote preparation slide, not the presentation itself. We can see all the slides.
Okay, now you can see the whole window though, right?
Yeah. I think if you just share a window, it shares that specific thing. So if you go into play mode,
let
it
me
doesn't.
just do it differently. Maybe I'll just share my second screen. This will hopefully work better. Now you can see just one slide, right?
Yeah, this is perfect.
Okay, great. Sorry. Okay, again. So first a bit about me. I'm from Germany. I did my bachelor there in electrical engineering and also a bit of business engineering. Then I did both my master and my PhD in Stockholm at KDH. And since October last year, I'm a postdoc at UPenn. My research is related to multi-robot systems with humans in the loop, formal methods like temporal logics in control. I do a bit of machine learning for safe control, learning safe control barrier function, and I'm also working on risk-aware autonomous systems. So it's control with a bit of computer science and robotics in the loop, I'd say. Okay, so first of all, disclaimer, this is my personal view on the review process, and I know that people have different views on certain aspects of what I'm going to talk about. So just take this as my personal opinion. G already talked a bit about the review process itself, and he summarized it really nicely. I just have an overview slide, and it basically says the same thing. It starts with the authors. The authors submit a paper, it goes to the senior editor selects an associate editor, and he or she distributes the paper to the reviewers, right? And the reviewers just review, and it's typically 3 or 4 reviewers in the journals in the control field, but it can be less, it can be more. And I guess in most of the cases, it's at least 2. The reviewers will write the reviews. It goes back to the associate editor. The associate editor writes a summary and a recommendation, and the editor makes a decision. Okay, so I guess we have seen that. And for conferences, it basically stops here. The authors get the notification, and it's either reject or accept. But when it's a journal, there are several stages. There are the rebuttal stages, where if the paper does not have been accepted, and it has only been conditionally accepted, or it has a revise and resubmit, then the manuscript gets updated, and the authors also provide a response letter, and the whole circle repeats until eventually rejected or eventually accepted. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about mainly is the perspective of a reviewer today. So let's see what that means. So what is expected of you, basically? And what it simply means is, and you will see this the more you progress in your PhD, that you will, as you become more of an expert in your area, you will be requested to review more papers for several conferences for different journals. And that basically means that the associate editor thinks that you are an expert in the field and that you are, you have the expertise to review the paper. So important is, first of all, to check a bit the criteria of the venue of the conference or journal. But typically, I mean, this is just generalizing a bit, there are 4 things that are important. You should assess the paper based on the presentation. And the presentation should be clear and concise. And G already also mentioned that it reflects a bit the attitude of the reviewers, of the authors. So if you see a paper that has a lot of typos in it, that's not a good sign. And that's definitely what you should comment on, right? And to me, it's actually a very big red flag. And the paper, of course, should also be self-contained to some extent. The second criteria is the contribution and the novelty. And there, he also talked about this. It's about how does it, if you think there's no novelty or contribution, then justify why it's not. And otherwise, also state, or you're also tasked to find out if there is a contribution or not. So this stage or this criteria requires you to also do some kind of a literature review, unless you already know the literature really well in this specific field. The third bullet is the fit to the journal's agenda or to the conference agenda. So obviously there are different conferences and journals, and they have different, things that are important to them. There are some journals that are more application oriented and others that are more theory oriented. And the same, of course, with topics, they can differ greatly. And the fourth criterion is the technical quality and the overall soundness. And we'll talk a bit more about this later. Okay, so these are, if I had to summarize what the criteria are that you or the associate editor wants you to look into, it's these four: presentation, contribution and novelty, the fit to the journal's agenda in a way, and the technical and overall soundness. Let me also mention that especially the third bullet is also something that already the editor and the associate editor should be looking into. So one common question, and you also commented on that, is, are you as a reviewer expected to understand and follow the whole paper? And the answer is in general, no, not necessarily. But you should put in a good effort, right? And I'll also come back to that point. But the bottom line is, the associate editor thinks you're an expert in the area, or you're related, your field is related, so you should put in a good effort. Okay, so that's just highlighting what is important. Okay, so now I'm just reviewing some more points. What is expected of you is to provide an honest review and an unbiased review. And unbiased here can mean many things. I guess we are all biased in a way, but we should try to put this aside. So several things I want to mention here is, you may have reviewed a paper of the authors already before, and this paper that you reviewed before may have been bad or good, but that doesn't mean that the current paper is also bad or good, right? And there are several other biases. For instance, if you see authors from several different countries, right, you may have a bias, and I guess the usual thing. So try to be unbiased, try to just put everything aside, just look at the paper's content, and also be honest in your review. Another important thing that seems to, not a lot of people do nowadays, or that often is a problem, is you should stick to deadlines. And if you can't, you should communicate this with the associate editor. There are many delays in the review process just because one reviewer doesn't stick to the deadline, and it's quite frustrating for the authors. So let's stick to the deadlines. Then another thing you're expected to do is to treat the paper confidentially. So just the technical content, just don't communicate it with anyone else, right? Don't give the paper to anyone else as it's not published. And then one point I want to make is, it's a community process. So we submit papers, and our papers get reviewed by reviewers who do this voluntarily. So at the same time, we should also accept some papers to review, right? Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the report itself. So typically, if I get requested to do a review, I spend 5 to 10 hours on journal papers and 2 to 4 hours on conference papers. And this, of course, greatly differs. When I started my PhD, I was spending much more time on papers, and now I'm really trying to reduce the amount of time, and you will find your own sweet spot there. So of this time that I mentioned here, 1/3 of my time I distributed into looking into what is the contribution and what is the problem formulation. Is the problem formulation well-defined? That's really important to me. A well-defined problem goes a long way, and also shows, again, the attitude of the authors. Then, sorry, someone is knocking here. Just give me a second.
One of the downsides of being at home, right? You can't control your environment.
Okay, sorry, sorry, Lindemann. It was again
No
because of
problem.
water leakage. All right, so where did I stop? Contribution and problem formulation is something I spent 1/3 of my time on. And then the other 1/3 is on technical details and checking the soundness. And then the other third is writing the review, actually, in the very end. And my review, my written report, basically consists of 4 sections. First, a summary. So I'm just summarizing the paper, what it is about, which problem it tries to deal with. And I then have a section that comments on the contribution of the paper. So here I really try to state what the novelty of the paper is. And I already give my opinion on whether or not the novelty, the contribution of the paper is big or is rather minor, right? And then I start, and this is for me the critical part, I state my general concerns, if I have any. And this is mostly related to contribution, to soundness of the paper, and to whether or not the presentation is clear. Okay. And then I have a section with major and minor comments on various parts of the paper. And I think, I mean, I'm not saying that this is the best structure, but I think it helps you to have a template for your reviews. And for me, this is just this one. I write a summary, I comment on the contribution, I write my general concerns, and then I make comments. Right? And now I want to list a bit about, you know, how I phrase these different parts. So just some general comments on that. I think it's very important to provide justification. So whatever you say, whatever you write, you should provide justification. If you think something is wrong, tell the authors why it's wrong. If you think something has been done, provide references and so on and so forth, right? Without that, it's just not gonna work. I ask a lot of clarifying questions. Often I'm not sure whether or not like when I think the theory is incorrect, I would rather first try to clarify things that I might have misunderstood, right? And this can be, again, technical details, and it can also concern notation, right? And I try to give the authors the benefit of the doubt. And that's why I think that the journal process is really nice. You can ask these clarifying questions, and you know, you let the authors respond, because you know, you may be wrong. The authors have been working on the manuscript for several months. You have read the paper for a day. And also in my final decision, after several rounds, I still give the authors the benefit of the doubt, because I believe to some extent in the test of time. So I don't want to be the reason why a paper gets rejected if I'm not entirely sure that it should be rejected, right? So if I'm really unsure, I would rather accept it than to reject it, because I think ultimately the test of time will show whether or not the paper has some contribution in it. I try to be fair and encouraging. That's just, I guess, common sense. And one advice I have is I submit a review one day after I completed the review. So sometimes you're getting tired, or you may even in some cases be annoyed by some parts of the paper, right? So I try to just write the review. The next day I read over it again and I polish it for, you know, being fair and encouraging and not being a jerk, as he said. So that's, I guess, an advice that helps me a lot. Just rereading the review one day after to just polish it a bit for being nice. For me, the overall deal breakers, so when I really will reject a paper, is when there is no contribution. Even after a revision, the authors cannot convince me that they have a clear and clean contribution, and that the paper is wrong or badly written. That's also for me a deal breaker. If I spot mistakes and in a journal the mistakes don't get fixed, I will reject. And the same if the language is really bad, the notation is really bad, and I can't follow the paper. So these are for me 3 things where I would definitely put a reject on. Okay, but again, that's my personal view. One other thing I want to mention is I think the confidential note that you have is really powerful. So whenever you submit your review to a conference or journal, there's a small box that says you have a confidential note to the associate editor. And I make really use of this note because I use this note to really say and remark on how confident I feel about the paper. And I remark on whether or not I've been able to check and follow the whole paper, right? If I haven't been able to check certain sections of the paper, I will just remark it there. And I will again, emphasize the main bottlenecks in the paper and what needs to be addressed, just as a summary, also for the associate editor. And I often more honestly and freely state my feeling about the paper. Okay, Sleiman, how am I in time?
You got 1 more minute or something like that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so just to wrap this up, my advice for you as a reviewer is set yourself boundaries. So you do this voluntarily, and you should spend some time on the paper, but you shouldn't overdo it, right? So like I said in the beginning, for journals, for me, it's 5 to 10 hours, for conference, 2 to 4 hours. And I do my very best in this time to follow most of the parts and judge the paper, but I will not spend 2 or 3 days on a paper. So set yourself boundaries. And this is, I guess, what Yi already mentioned is I try to assess the soundness of the paper and try to check for correctness. But to some extent, we have to trust the authors, right? It's their job to ensure the correctness of the paper, but I'll do my best to do like soundness checks and sanity checks. And another one that I kind of should have learned earlier is if you don't feel comfortable reviewing because you think the paper is not within your expertise, just don't do it. And what really helps the associate editor is if you suggest an alternative reviewer. So just, go ahead. If you know people like PhD colleagues or postdoc colleagues that are expert in this field, just recommend their names with an email address to the associate editor. That will help much more. And the last one, just learn from other reviews. So when you do a journal review, you will get back the author response, right? And the authors will respond to not only your comments, but also to the comments of the other reviewers. And if you read through them, you will actually learn a lot. And it's quite interesting to see how other people review papers and think in the process. Okay, that's about it. That's what I wanted to talk about, mainly about the perspective as a reviewer.
Yeah. Thank you, Lars, for the interesting presentation. We'll move on to Xuejiao. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Let me share my screen. Good. You can see my screen now. Okay, great. So thanks everyone. So first I would like to thank Lindemann and also Yi and also all the CSSC committee members for inviting me to this event and for organizing this event. It's really interesting, and I'm happy here to share a bit of the personal perspectives on the topic of paper publication and also the review process. So I think let me try to put it into the presentation mode. Great. So basically, Ge and also Lars have already provided quite a bit of the suggestions and feedback on the paper submission process. So here I will describe a bit about how to get your paper published successfully. So first, from my personal perspective, writing the paper is similar to telling a story. So basically, you should first think about the story you want to tell. So what is the key message you want to deliver with the paper you want to write? So first think about the logic, which is similar to a bone of the paper. Like you should first put up the structure of the paper, think about the logic line behind it. And also whenever I start writing the paper or start thinking about the paper, I would put down some keywords of this paper and write down them in the logic way. And then I will, after this process, I will start filling the ingredients, which is, for example, the methods and the stuff into it. And the second point, which is really important, is to ask for the feedback. So this is especially important when you start your PhD, for example. So basically, what I remember when I started my PhD, so I did my PhD in Power Systems Laboratory, which is the same laboratory I'm in right now. And when I started writing my first paper, I was a bit lost. And after finishing the first paper, actually, I thought the paper was in a good shape, but actually it was not. And I sent the paper to both my colleagues and the supervisors. And I mean, I first discussed the paper with my colleague, which was a PhD postdoc at that time, and he has much more experience than I do. So he provided me a lot of good feedback, and also in terms of writing, and also the way to present the results, the method. And then I also sent it to my supervisor, and I remember for the first paper I wrote, there were more than 10 rounds of feedback thing. And I mean, for the first one, even though the abstract got accepted, my supervisor and I finally decided that we will not submit it to the camera version, like the final version, because we basically think the quality is not good enough. But I mean, this kind of process really helps me to improve my skill of writing, and also the skill of presenting the thing like in the academic writing way. And I mean, after this process, and when I look back at the first version and also the second, third, I thought like, wow, I did really improve a lot from this process. I did learn quite a lot from this process. So it's really important to ask for the feedback from your supervisors and colleagues, or your friends, whoever has more experience and more knowledge than you do. And one important part is to select the journal. This one is for journal, but also it fits also for the conference. So when you try to submit something for a journal, or you try to submit something to the conference, you first could make a list of the potential journals or conferences that might be interesting to you. So to look for the list, first you can check the scope of the journal or the conference, and also the criteria, and also the publication duration. Because I mean, some of the journals, they might take a lot longer time for the publication, and I mean 1 year or 2 years even. So this kind of information you could find it on some forums. I think you can Google it, and most of the time you can find some feedback that is provided by others. And also the type of paper. So some of the journals might be specifically for reviews, or some might be for some letters stuff. And yeah, you should check that and to see if your paper fits into that. And also one important thing, that each conference or journal, they might have some limitations on the page length. So that is also important, especially when your paper is really long. So make sure you check that beforehand. And the submission guidelines, you should also check that. So basically it covers the word and page count that I just mentioned. And also you should also check the list of required documents. Most of the time you would prepare some conflict of interest letter, and also the manuscript, and also some might ask you to submit the original LaTeX file, or etc. And sometimes you could also provide the data that you use for the submission. And how to respond to reviewers' comments. So Ge and also Lars have already commented a lot on this topic. So basically, the first important thing you saw two figures here. The left figure here basically is like it pictured like one guy holding the paper, and there is a way towards the paper exception, and on the way there were like a lot of men holding the swords and stuff to basically trying to punch this guy. I mean, this is definitely not an easy process, an easy way, and most of the time it's not a happy journey, I would say. But I mean, most of the time, I mean, this is a very good way to improve the quality of your paper. And I mean, for most of the articles, the quality did improve after this process. And I mean, on the right-hand side, you see a picture that is a man that was really angry because I got some major comments on his article. So I mean, after receiving the feedback, especially if it's major comments, after going through the comments, you might not feel happy. I think most of the time you will not be. And try to take some time, like to process the comments. And as already suggested, maybe you should leave the comments aside for a few days or even a week or more to be like to get back to the normal emotional state, I would say. And don't reply the comments or response to the comments when you're really angry. This is not a good way. And also see it as a learning process, because I mean sometimes like the reviewer that provided a lot of feedbacks, like a long list of comments to your paper, is also the one that spend a lot of time, normally spend a lot of time on reading your paper and reviewing your paper. So say it as a learning process and try to learn from the comments that they provided. And the third thing is be objective, polite, and respectful. So I mean, most of the reviewers, they will not try to attack you, but they're trying to help you to improve the quality of the paper. So be respectful to each of the comment they provide. And the other thing is make changes, necessary changes. So it's not necessary that you make changes, make all the changes that they suggested. But the rule of thumb is that basically whenever you have some changes or something that you will not want to change, something that they suggested but you don't want to change, but so in this case you need to provide some justifications why you think you don't need to change it. And the last thing is be specific and clear in your reply. So normally what I do is that basically I will list down the comments that each reviewer have, and then I will list down, I will basically distinguish the comments they have, and also the answer I have, and also the changes I've made with different colors. So in the reply letter, it's really clear and also convenient for the reviewer to see which is which, and also try to prepare a manuscript with the changes highlighted in red or different colors, basically. And then the reviewer, it's easier for the reviewer to see the changes they made, and also the comments or the responses you provided. And it will save them also a lot of time, I think. And yeah, that's basically the thing. And how to survive this process? Well, this is a figure that basically shows most of the time that's the status of people that whenever you write your paper or trying to respond to the reviews comments, you will sleep less, and also you will drink a lot of coffee. And I mean, this is very very tiring process. And I mean, how to survive this process is first important to make schedules. So especially writing papers. So you based on the deadline. I mean, journals do not have deadlines, but the conference papers does have deadlines. And make the schedules based on the deadlines. And even for the journals, I would suggest making schedules. I mean, sometimes it's a bit tricky without having the hard deadline ahead. I mean, making schedules, it will make yourself more efficient in writing this paper and also doing your other works. And the second point is be prepared for all the results. So I think especially for journals, sometimes the process could be really different for everyone, and the time you take to get everything, to get your paper published, it really depends. And sometimes I would say you need a bit of luck to get your paper published within a short time. So be prepared for all results. And the third point is take breaks. So I think it's really important. So I think especially for myself, I think sometimes I think it's important to take holidays like 1 week or two, so that you can be refreshed, I would say. I mean, some people would think that they would use every minute to focus on the work, but I think after some time, people definitely get tired, and the efficiency will go down for sure. So take breaks and to have some fun, even though the paper does not get published, right? So that's really important for your mental health, I think. So with this, I would like to finish the presentation and hand it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Xuejiao. That was a very interesting talk as well. Gave us a different perspective on things. I guess finally, last but not least, Ben, you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Yeah, let me share this. How's the aspect ratio on that?
Not great.
Okay, let me try something else. May have to just share the window. Yeah, unfortunately, I do not have a monitor set up with a good resolution and aspect ratio. So yeah, I'll just share the PowerPoint screen. Okay. Yeah, so sorry, you'll have to get a little bit of the stuff in the gutters, but you should at least be able to see the content. Is it a good size now?
Yeah, great.
Okay. All right, so yeah, thank you for having me on the panel. I know I'm coming at the end, so we've heard a lot of great stuff already about how to review and respond to reviews. And my name is Ben. I'm, as Simon mentioned, a fourth-year PhD student here at the Con Lab at UT-Dallas. So hopefully my perspective will be slightly different from the people we've heard from, since I am still a PhD student. And again, these are my own personal opinions and just kind of a selection of advice about giving reviews and receiving them. So I kind of split it into those two halves. So first I'll just talk about how to give a review. So from my perspective, your job as a reviewer, I mean, your primary goal, which is in alignment with what people have already said, is basically just to ensure that the paper that you're reviewing meets the quality standards of the venue it's being submitted to. And people have discussed already what that entails, like the technical soundness, if it's appropriate for the venue and so forth. But then I think we do have a secondary role, which is not perhaps strictly necessary, but I think it's definitely a goodwill gesture that we as reviewers can easily put forward to the people we're reviewing, which is to help the authors create the best version of their paper possible. And it's just an easy thing for us to do because we've already taken the time to review the paper, so we're already aware of it. And as a fresh set of eyes, we can easily and quickly just suggest ways to make it better. And that also helps us as reviewers advocate for other readers down the line who are going to be reading this paper if it does get published. So this is something I don't think has been touched on too much yet, but just the topic of whether or not to accept a review request, especially if you're a PhD student. So like for me, I remember when I first got my first paper review request, I think I had not been a PhD student for very long, maybe a year or less, and I was confused why I was receiving a review request as someone with so little experience. But then, after talking to lab mates, it's oh, well, actually, PhD students are quite often requested to review papers, and our perspective is actually valuable So I would definitely recommend don't be afraid to accept a review request, even if you feel a little inexperienced. You're only 1 or 2 years into your PhD, because you do have some knowledge and perspective to give, and because your review will just be one of several reviews that forms a whole impression to the editors. And this goes along with Lars's comment that you do have the confidential note to the AE, so you can feel free to accept the review request, write your review, and then just indicate the level of authority that you have on the things that you're reviewing about. For yourself, practice makes better, so it's better to just start early and just start accepting relevant review requests. And these, all the publications, basically, they need reviewers to be reviewing these papers because there's just an incredible volume of papers that are being submitted these days. So it is a way to give back, especially once you start publishing your own papers and submitting, to give back to the publications that you submit to. But then on the other hand, you should only accept review requests that you can complete ahead of the deadline, that you can, handle under your bandwidth, and how much you have on your plate at a particular time. And of course, sometimes it's seasonal. You might get 5 review requests for a conference because all the papers for that conference are getting submitted at the same time. And you can delegate as you need and refer to other colleagues that you have, and only accept review requests that you have some domain knowledge about, which usually will happen naturally. People are going to generally only going to recruit you for reviews on topics that you've either published about already, or that people know that you're something of an expert, a developing expert on. And of course, you'll never know everything about the paper before you sit down and review it, so you don't need to feel like you know everything about the paper in order to accept a review request. Due diligence is something that we should do, meaning looking into the existing literature and seeing if the result or paper that is under review has already been covered by the literature that exists. And the 3 main tools that I think we all use are your domain knowledge, which is just your own expertise and wisdom about the work in your field, which is obviously the easiest because it's already sitting up in your brain. So you can use that, if you just know offhand, a certain paper covers a similar topic, you can go look into it and make sure there's not too much overlap. And then the other thing is citation chains. So obviously, start with the papers that are being referenced by the paper that you're reviewing, and make sure that they don't in fact cover the paper itself. This just goes into checking the novelty. And then one thing that I've actually run into is be aware of your contextual bias, just meaning we tend to be pretty familiar with a handful of journals and conferences, especially in our country, or if you're especially for United States, and there's a lot of international conferences, some European ones, some Asian ones. Just be aware that the same results can be published in journals from different countries, and some results even go by different names depending on what country they were in. So it's worth checking out journals and conferences from other countries and searching there, and not just limiting yourself to journals and conferences that you're aware of. And then by the same token, you can use search terms to look through your library database or Google Scholar to find these papers. And kind of by the same token, sometimes you may know a concept by a certain name, but someone else gives just a totally different name to it. So it's worth using the citation chain and looking at terms that come up in these other papers to figure out what these equivalent terms are and search on those. And then when it comes time to write the review, I'm pretty much just echoing what's been said before, but we want to speak the truth in kindness, and the golden rule is kind of review as you want to be reviewed. So we have these kind of dual duties to the paper to ensure quality standards, but also to the authors to not totally blast them and destroy their mental health in the process. So I kind of like to play both the devil's advocate and the angel's advocate to avoid bias when giving the review. So, obviously you need to, and for me, this is kind of like the hard part is like looking at what about the paper just stinks, like what is wrong with this paper. I mean, actually like take a very critical eye instead of just, accepting it as completely true or completely correct. So yeah, try to look through the claims and the technical results as much as you can to find which are plainly wrong, especially if like if there's a contrary result from the prior literature. But then always like explain like why you think it's wrong, and if possible, like give pathways to like fix things. Like especially if you know how to fix it, like just let the authors know. I mean, you're not responsible for solving all of their problems, but if it's something obvious and you know like what the issue is, just let them know, and ask for clarification, especially in like the journal review process if you're not 100% sure that a result is incorrect. And then on the other side, I think it is good to play the angel's advocate and look for like what about the paper is good, what claims have been rigorously proven, where all of the math checks out and there's no mistakes, and write that in the review, and evaluate the benefit of the paper. Like what are the authors showing can be done now that could not be done before? Again, like the novelty, and give some kind of evaluation of how important the results are. So that's kind of my thoughts on writing reviews. And then I think it's also important to, as others have mentioned, like discuss how we receive reviews and respond to reviews. So when you're responding as an author, we always have to be prepared to give a defense of our papers and the claims we're making, but we need to do it with gentleness and respect in the language we use when we respond. And yeah, this for me is definitely something I struggle with. Like just don't get discouraged, especially at an initial rejection, because like for some venues, that's almost like a de facto standard initial decision. It's like a revise and resubmit. Like very rarely will you get a decision that's just like a carte blanche acceptance. So definitely try not to get discouraged if you see that. And even if like the comments seem like rude or very like blunt, try not to take too much personal offense at that. And then of course, take all the issues and concerns pointed out by the reviewers seriously and address them point by point, which goes back to when you're giving a review. It of course helps to give like a numbered bulleted list of like all of your particular concerns, and then the authors can respond easily in an organized fashion to that. And then I think an important thing is when you respond, like don't just repeat verbatim what was already in the initial submission. Like either say something new that addresses the comment, or say the same thing in a different way that will actually like give clarification to what you meant, like if it was a technical claim. And then just be diplomatic in all the language and gestures that you use in your response. Thank your editors and reviewers for taking the time out of their schedules to actually read your paper and give it some attention, and that will make everyone feel better in this process, which is completely voluntary, as was mentioned. And then the last thing I'll just mention is like just dealing with rejection. Like sometimes you put your best effort forward, you revise, resubmit, and sometimes it still gets rejected. So we just need, this is kind of just the serenity to accept the things you can't change, courage to change the things you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So yeah, sometimes like if the paper is just completely rejected, it's good to like do an honest post-mortem on the submission. So even though it's like dead on this submission, you're probably going to, you'll probably revise it and resubmit it somewhere else, in all honesty. So if you felt the rejection was unfair, look into like how you could have presented the work more convincingly. And if you felt the rejection was in fact fair, then be willing to revise and beef up the contributions of your paper and resubmit. And then give the reviewers the benefit of the doubt that they were acting in good faith to maintain the high quality standards of the venue. Because of course, that's what we've all said, like we're called to do as reviewers. So we just have to assume that that's what they're doing. Even, sometimes stubbornness or politics can't get involved, but we can't assume that. And then just in terms of like mental health, it's good to realize that basically everyone has a paper rejected at some point. So it's something that almost everyone has to deal with eventually. So you're not alone. and realize that there's more to your life than just a few paper rejections. And, there's more to even just your academic and research career than the papers that are published or rejected. And then the last thing I'll just say is it's incredibly helpful to find, a solid group of people that are on your side that you can talk with and vent to if, you have a rejection and it's like really affecting you. So it could be your advisor if you have a good relationship with them, which I hope everyone does, and your lab mates because they're very much in the same position you are, and then even just close friends, even if they're not researchers, just people you can like share your struggles with. So yeah, those are my thoughts and small advice from a PhD student on reviewing, and that'll conclude my portion.
All right, thank you, Ben. I would like to thank all the panelists, G, Lars, Xuejiao, and Ben for their great talks. Before we actually move on to the open discussion, I would like to also point out one other thing, one other resource, which is this greatresearch.org. It's basically a website that has a lot of information about the things that you can use to do good research, including how to review papers. And I remember this was one of the very first resources that I learned about when reviewing papers. I actually got my first paper to review when I was still an undergrad. And back then I was like super scared, like, am I qualified to do this? Or, all of these different things. And I think one of the important things is that you shouldn't be too scared. I think Ben noted that you shouldn't be scared to accept a review. It would be good to have a supervisor, like your advisor or something, that you can also talk to about this, or even like researchers in your close group, so that you can get some help during your first review. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But getting your first review also done I think is as important as getting your first paper published. It does provide you with also another perspective on things and teaches you a lot. And that was my short story. I guess from here we'll move on to the open discussion section. Yeah, so we will continue recording this one. And over here we'll basically just try to take all your questions and maybe answer them. So feel free to raise your hand, and then once we call you, maybe unmute yourself, or you can type in your question into the chat box. If you want the question directed at a specific panelist, please mention them by name. Otherwise, it's basically up for anyone. And if you want to share your own experience, go ahead and do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Just, raise your hand, unmute, and we'll proceed from there. Right, I guess we got our first question from Sita, I think. Sorry
Yeah.
if I...
Yeah. Hello,
Okay.
everyone. Am I audible?
Well, yeah, go ahead. You can.
Yeah.
ask
Yeah,
your
my
questions.
question is CSE is going to help us in intimating any further seminars or like the journals which is expected to submit a paper or an abstract? Because I have just started my PhD in this spring, and I don't get any informations like from the specific organizations. When is the next paper publication to be submitted, or when is your next conferences? And yeah, sometimes my supervisor used to intimate me, but is we going to get some information from CSS about that, or it's not belong to this committee at all?
Okay, so if your question is strictly about whether CSSC will tell you about these things, then our newsletter does give out reminders about certain paper deadlines. But I guess also figuring out what kind of deadlines you have for certain papers goes back to Xuejiao's discussion on, searching for searching for papers and figuring out what those deadlines are, and knowing what to submit for. Yeah, I don't know, Xuejiao or anyone else, if you guys have any comments on this.
I mean, basically talking to colleagues and PhD friends, I would say. That's how I learned it in the beginning of my PhD. Everyone was throwing around abbreviations like ACC, CDC, and I was like, yeah, what is that? Just ask them about, where do you usually submit? Like people who are close to the research that you're doing, you can ask them like, what are the 2 or 1 premier conferences like that you submit to? When are the deadlines typically? And also the journals, they will most likely be able to help you for your specific case. That's at least how I learned it. And also your supervisor, maybe he or she is helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And the second question is how to improve like the reading speed, to accelerate the reading speed, or when we read a paper, as I find for everyone, it's a very common when you start reading a paper for the first time, you take like 1 or 2 days, and then you after you develop the habit, it get reduced to some hours. So I also face the same difficulty. Like when I read a paper, first of all, I don't get what is really written in that, and but I take a lot of time in reading. So I just loses like more than 2-3 days in completing a paper of like 12 to 20 pages. So what are the points? What are the key points should be really seen when we read a paper instead of reading line by line and understanding it? Can you throw some light on that?
Once. So, I mean, I had the same basically. When I think back, my first review was a transactions on automatic control, what we abbreviate by TAC paper. It was 16 pages. It took me 2.5 days. And, I think it comes a bit with experience. And in the beginning, your reviews will just take a bit longer, and that shouldn't frustrate you. I think in the beginning of your PhD, you have a bit more time. You have not too many projects going on. So take the time, 2 days for a paper, read through it line by line, and you will learn with experience where the important parts are in the paper later on. I wouldn't have a general suggestion how to accelerate this process. It's really, a feeling after a while that you get what the important papers are in the, of the paper in the end. That's at least my take on it. And then, as you get more experience, the time it takes to review a paper will get significantly less. And I can assure you in a year or 2, you will not review a paper for 2 or 3 days. But I think the first 1 or 2 papers will always take a bit longer. Partially because later you will know more what to look for, but also, just in the beginning, you try to be very, very thorough. And, later on, you, as I said, you need to trust the authors also in a way. And, once you do that, the time also reduces. That's,
Oh, great. Really, thanks a lot. Thanks for this.
So don't feel bad if you take 2 or 3 days in the beginning for a review.
Okay.
That's normal.
Okay.
And that's a good learning too, right? I mean, while you learn the paper line by line, you not only learn how you should review or how your own style of review is, you also see how once you write a paper, how you structure it yourself. So, I mean, you're not learning to review at this point. You're learning the whole thing, basically.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Right, good
And
question.
I want to add one more point.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I basically had the same problem when I started reviewing papers. I mean, we all do control theory related research, right? We know that sometimes there are so many equations and theorems or propositions inside a paper, right? Which sometimes makes the paper really hard to follow, right? What I did is that I make sure I read the introductions and abstract again and again if I struggle to understand the paper. I think sometimes this helps me because at least I get an idea on what the authors are trying to do in this paper, right? I mean, if you struggle with the math or the derivations, you can always go to the introduction and then at least understand what what the authors are trying to do, and then you can maybe spend more time in the technical details trying to figure out how they actually do it, right? And I also think you need to think about this from the other side, right? if a great, I mean, let's say this, right? If you really carefully spend like say hours per day reading this paper for like 3 or 4 days and still couldn't understand what the paper is talking about, it might be a sign that this paper itself is not really written in a very good way, right? If nobody understands what the authors are trying to tell, I mean, what the information the author is trying to convey, you know, it might be a bad sign for the paper, right? So don't blame yourself. That's my point.
Right, right.
I would also just add one thing. A lot of papers, I mean, generally there's, you know, the amount of like new unique stuff is generally like the abstract, maybe part of the introduction, maybe the numerical results, part of the conclusion, and then like maybe a few key results in the body of the paper. But a lot of like, especially content at the beginning of a paper is just like introductory material, notation, introducing, and even like some of the like techniques or just like review of like standard like techniques or things that have already been proposed in the literature before. So of course, like with experience, you learn like what some of those things are, and you can just skip some of that and like just get to like what is the actual novelty of it. And that's also like a good reason to like check the papers that are cited in the paper you're reviewing, because you can put it side by side with the paper that you're reviewing and look at like where the differences are. And if you're lucky, like eventually you may find like an earlier paper that was like presented well and maybe like covered like the introductory stuff in a clear and concise manner that can like get you up to speed if you're not already familiar with those things.
Okay, thank you.
It's a nice addition. Any other comments about this question?
So maybe one additional point from my side. So I think it's also important to make sure that you have the ability to review the paper before getting to the review process, because sometimes maybe you don't have the background or the knowledge to review this, then it's just like you can maybe contact the editor that you would not be able to finish this review process. Yeah, I think it's totally fine to do this. Yeah.
Great advice. All right, so I guess that covers the first question. Because we have another question in the chat from Venkat. Basically says, in general, how do we speed up the journal review process from submitting to publishing stage? Some journals have 2 to 3 years turn up. And by that time, as a student, you maybe lose touch with old papers due to new works and so on.
Yeah, that's a common issue. I mean, that's why I was saying that it's important to stick to deadlines, so that the next generation of researchers, that we're all a bit more reliable, that we only accept papers if we can stick to the deadline. Because I mean, yeah, these 2-year turnarounds are really annoying in many ways. I mean, one advice maybe for the first, second year PhDs, there are fast track journals. So there are journals that guarantee you rejection or acceptance within 6 months. But these are typically smaller journals, which is not necessarily bad, but you will only have, at least in the control field, 6 pages as opposed to 16, 20 pages.
Such as LCSS.
Right, and then from the Robotics and Automation Society, I mean, following up on what Lars and Lindemann mentioned, there's a letter called the Robotics and Automation Letter, which is also 6 pages, and then the turnaround time is fairly short as well. So if you really need your publication to be published very quickly, right? I think that's going to be a very good choice for you. And I mean, this question itself is really, I mean, oftentimes you hear complaints from both sides, right? Reviewers complain that they have too much work to do right? And then they do this basically for free, right? As Lars mentioned in his presentation, we are basically volunteers, right? And then the authors also complain that they're not getting decent reviews on time, right? Sometimes they just get trash reviews, or basically one sentence after 2 years waiting, right? Yeah, so it's a really good question. I just don't know what is the answer to your question.
Yeah, basically I asked this question because the turnaround time between the reviews, like between the first and second review, it's like exorbitantly long. Like sometimes it takes like 6 months or 8 months.
Yeah.
By that time, you know, we would have moved to another project, working on that project so long, and then sometimes we lose touch of the old works. So that's why I was concerned. Like, how do you guys went through such? Did you guys went through such process? How did you cope up with that? That's it.
Yeah. I guess the earlier you accept it, the better it is for your mental health. But I mean, my strategy there, for me, it's important that the research I did gets disseminated in a way. So my strategy is always to have a conference in which I want to distribute or disseminate the idea. And then I would write a journal, and well, it just takes between 1 or 2 years or 2.5 years.
Okay.
I try to not check the homepage anymore, the paper plaza or whatever, the statues of the paper. It's just frustrating.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing, recently I was talking to someone, and that person very proudly kind of said that, oh, to TAC, I only submit papers 3 months after the deadline. And I was like, so I think we should get rid of this kind of thinking. Really, like the next generation accept reviews when, we are able to do them in time, and not delay other people's works, because that's kind of very unfair, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. So Mutsamani in the comments or in the chat is saying we have some topics which have not done research yet in the university. Sometimes we are the first person working on it. How did you manage these types of papers? Hardest part is when research is combined with industry-based projects, so it will be time-consuming. The main question is that some works are kind of on very new and may combine research and industry-based projects. So I guess is the question with publishing or with reviewing such papers?
Because for publishing, it's great, right? If there has not been done any research, you have a contribution. So, yeah. So I think it's good if you're working on something new, maybe that is, combining more practical aspects from industry and with theoretical aspects from academia. Then and no one has ever worked on that, then it's quite easy to sell your contribution if you write the paper well. That's good, I think.
Yeah, the question is not so clear to me, but basically, even though the research topic you're trying to address is really novel, I think you like each paper, it will not start from nowhere, right? You should have some like a theoretical background for the papers. So I think you can start from there maybe.
I guess I will ask also a question that has to do more with the acceptance of papers. So as we talked before, usually there are 2, maybe 3 or 4 or even 5 reviewers for a paper, and then as a reviewer we make the choice of, or at least we answer the question, do you reject or accept? And sometimes there are weak reject and weak accept. So after all of those basically votes get casted by the reviewers, and the associate editor wants to make a decision. Is the decision to accept a paper made if there's a unanimous vote among all of the, or if every reviewer said accept, or do you also get acceptances in cases where you have weak accepts or potentially like a weak reject? So let's say you have 4 reviewers and 3 of them said accept, and then one of them gave a weak reject, for example. Does the associate editor have the ability to maybe weigh these different results and give out an accept or reject based on that? Or should it be everyone says accept for an acceptance to be made?
I think when I when I work as the AE and then assign papers to different reviewers, I basically summarize all their feedback and their comments, and then when doing so, ignore those that are not really valuable comments. I mean, you can tell from reading their comments, right? Like some people just spend like say 5 minutes reading through a paper. They basically just took a glance and they say this is not good or not this is good, right? Sometimes I ignore those comments because you can tell they're not spending time, right? Now, for all the valuable comments that you gather from all different reviewers, I never took just the average of their scores. Let's say somebody's giving A, somebody's giving B, somebody's giving C. I never do A plus B plus C divided by 3. I never do that. I basically also go through the paper and then provide my own feedback for the paper as well. And then based on the feedback from other people, I submit a recommendation to the senior editors. Basically, I just tell him these are the drawbacks, basically pros and cons, and then I personally think this paper should be weekly rejected, weekly accepted, things like that. And I'm pretty sure for either control or robotic conferences, we have the evaluation system, right? When you submit your reviews, right? They ask you how confident you are in this field, what is the score that you give for this paper, things like that, right? And then I think finally the senior editors will just make the decisions. So it's not like everybody has to say accept to make a paper be accepted.
See, so I guess we have just 1 or 2 more minutes. So before wrapping up, we'll take this final question, hopefully a very quick one. So Karthik in the chat said, is it ever okay to basically contact the authors directly about any minor clarifications on the paper, or should all communications be restricted to the flow, basically to maintain confidentiality? So sometimes, yeah. Jay, I think you're muted. I guess you said no, never contact directly.
Don't do that.
Yeah. All right.
I mean, if you want people to hate you, yeah, you can do it, right? But otherwise, don't do it.
All right. Guess that is basically all the time we have for today. Gravell, I think you raised your hand. Do you have any final clarification to make?
Yeah, no, I have a quick question since the last question was quite interesting. So I'm wondering what are your thoughts are on revealing your identity as a reviewer, signing off your name at the end. I mean, I think that if you're complaining a lot about a paper, obviously no one wants to do that. But say you see a paper, you really like it, and you want to say that, hey, I reviewed this. So what are the thoughts on that?
My question was more along the lines of, say, numerical analysis or code. A lot of people mention if you are interested in the data set or in the code, contact the author. How valuable is that information in making your review decision or your review feedback? Is it okay to contact them, especially in cases like journals? You have some amount of conversation between the reviewer and the author, but indirectly, but for sake of conferences, it's mostly just a one-time communication. So in cases like that, how do you approach the problem?
It's a tough one. So I guess there are two questions in that question. Basically, Kaveh's and Karthik's comments. Basically, if you're happy with something, can you say that, hey, I reviewed this and I like it? And then the other is, regardless of your review, like outside of the review, can you say, hey, I'm a reviewer of this paper and I wanted to get more information about this specific experiment or get more details about this or so? Any quick comments on that?
Possible small extension to that would be, is it ever okay to, irrespective of individually contacting, is it okay for, say, the reviewer to contact the associate editor, for the associate editor to contact the author requesting more information? Is that okay even in a conference setting as opposed to a journal setting?
So I myself would never do this. I will never contact the authors or review in any way to review that I am the reviewer, just to avoid any conflict of interest or anything. That's.
Yeah, and I think like if you have such a case, you should ask the associate editor. Maybe they have policies, journal or conference policies. So I don't think there's a general answer to that. I would always, if you decide to do that for whatever reason, I would ask the associate editor first if that's okay or not. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for your comment.
I guess try not to reveal your identity. That's the takeaway. All right. Yeah, I guess that's a little bit more than the time we had. Thank you all for sticking to the very end. Again, G, Xuejiao, Lars, and Ben, thank you for being panelists on this talk. And for all the audience, thank you for joining in today. And I hope to see you again in future CSSC events. Have a good rest of your day. See you later.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you, guys.